Thank you, Chair, and it's a joy to make this statement under your chairmanship, and I'd like to thank the House for making time for this important statement today. Before I address the substance of this report, I do want to pay tribute to all the former hostages and families who helped contribute to this inquiry, many of whom are here today, and I know that today's discussion will not be an easy one for them. Their testimonies were raw, incisive, and driven by determination to make sure that other people and other families do not endure the pain that they have survived, and it is a tale of being a survivor. To constructively propose that we learn lessons was the goal of our report, and that is why these families contributed them, because they want to make sure that we can better get our people home. I also want to pay tribute to all those in this place who have worked so tirelessly for their constituents who've been unfairly detained abroad. And it was interesting in our report that it showed that where members of Parliament engage, it is a far more impressive response that we receive from the government, and actually far more attention is garnered in terms of that individual's case. Of course, it would be remiss of me not to say thank you to those FCDO staff who do work tirelessly to try and get people home. But ultimately, we are calling here for change and for improvements. State hostage-taking, we all know, are the actions of failing, autocratic and desperate states. The testimonies we heard were of how hostages were drugged, beaten, emotionally tortured, deprived of access to consular support, let alone the love of their families that can give them that strength to continue. They are all survivors. And today, we have people who are being arbitrarily detained and held hostage for political leverage and advantage across the world. And I think this is an opportunity for us to say as a Parliament that we urge all countries to immediately release those being held. In particular, and I'm sorry for not being able to list the names of all those being held, but we call for the release of Vladimir Kara-Murza, the release of Jimmy Lai, Morad Tabaz, Jagdish Singh Johal, all those British citizens that are being unjustly detained. We think it's really important the government takes a zero-tolerance position to every incident of arbitrary detention, because in these incidents, British citizens aren't afforded their consular rights. They're not treated in line with international standards, and they end up being used as diplomatic pawns, and that is where the government must bring maximum pressure, because the first priority of government is to keep our people safe. And we're seeing an alarming increase in states actively pursuing the kidnapping of hostages as a form of foreign policy. State hostage-taking and arbitrary detention are heinous and destructive, and they are stealing the years and years of the lives of those held hostage and their families. But as I've said, this is about blackmail. And I'm afraid that we found as a committee that the government's approach is lacking. And disappointingly, and I'm really disappointed in this because we haven't seen this from the government until now, they did not sufficiently engage with our recommendations and the evidence and experience of detainees and their families. In the past, every time we make a recommendation, each recommendation is taken turn one after another and dealt with in real detail. There were some recommendations where there was no response at all from the government. It was almost as if they wanted to pretend that the recommendation did not exist. And this is not the sort of response we normally see from the government. And so I was deeply frustrated by this. We identified a number of key risks in the way the government currently handle cases. First of all, we found a lack of consistency in the way information updates are shared with the families of those being held hostage or arbitrarily detained. We found a lack of consistency in the way in which information and updates are shared. And we found that ministerial reshuffles have slowed progress on securing a hostage's release. And there was no evidence of institutional knowledge being shared to make sure that that wasn't the case. Concerningly, we also found a trend of negotiations being deprioritised against other diplomatic priorities, when ultimately, and look, I was a former Foreign Office civil servant, geopolitics matters, but the ultimate job of the Foreign Office is keeping our people safe and getting them home. And if we cannot do that, that should be the fundamental question about whether or not we are delivering as a Foreign Office. Having reviewed the evidence as well as international best practice, it became clear that handling hostage cases has to be designated to a specific senior official. We've seen this work in the US. We have seen the difference it has made in terms of getting people home. We called for the creation of a director for arbitrary and complex detentions. This individual would have a mandate for coordinating responses to cases, acting as a consistent point of contact to families, organising cross-government action, cutting through the silos that we know affect these cases, leading the UK's response to multilateral fora, and having a direct line to the Prime Minister, because that is how you get people free. And I have sat in meetings in COBRA, National Security Council meetings, where we sat and discussed as officials what we could do to get people home. And it was only in that form that we ever made meaningful difference and progress. Having this individual whose sole focus, where they know every single family, and Roger Carson's in the US is an incredible individual, and yes, it has to be the right individual. But when you meet with him, he knows every single family, every single case. And the fact that I'm going to him to ask for help with British cases demonstrates how effective he can be, and why we're so very disappointed that there was a lack of meaningful engagement with this proposal. In addition to this key recommendation, we looked at a lack of consistency and accuracy in public statements made by the government in specific cases. Sometimes, which is deeply concerning, basic levels of consular access weren't even afforded by the Vienna Convention. That, we know, is not always in the hands of the Foreign Office, but they should be making complaints and making clear that the host government knows that that is unacceptable. There were some cases where people said to us, no, it's not our duty to go and stand outside a court while an arbitrarily detained person is being held and heard under appalling and completely illegal circumstances. If you as a Foreign Office official are not willing to stand outside outside a courthouse, no matter how dangerous it is, what does that say about your commitment to the British national who is being potentially drugged, potentially beaten, and is most certainly terrified for their future? We have a duty to be there. And when we've done it, for example, in Mexico, where the ambassador stood outside despite the fact it was a Mexican individual being murdered, we secured the first ever prosecution of a democratically elected individual for ordering the murder of a civilian. It makes a difference that we show up. And too many families feel that we do not show up, and they get standardised responses week after week after week. It is imperative that, therefore, we use every means at our disposal to ensure even the most basic level of consular access for detained UK citizens. And that does mean working with our allies. And the reality is that time after time, and it's a shame the Canada conference was cancelled, I hear from counterparts that when we get together in multilateral fora, actually what you see is the first 2 hours of meetings being wasted on fighting over what arbitrary detention means. That was one of our recommendations. Let's decide what arbitrarily detained means. If we can have a definition that we use internally, then we might have a chance at getting a multilateral definition agreed. The fact that we don't have one internally is a big problem. But state hostage-taking and arbitrary detention are not the same, and the problem is currently that the government's approach has a poor classification of these consular cases that results in confusion and results in less effective management of their cases. The incoherence in classification created bureaucratic delays in a number of cases, damaged momentum on releases, and we found several terms were being used to classify hostages, with ministers and officials completely reluctant to clarify how they had reached each classification. Even when there was international determinations that someone was being arbitrarily detained, the government was not itself recognising it. As someone who is a UN Security Council permanent member who stands up for multilateralism, we should be accepting international conclusions where a British national has been arbitrarily detained. Because this confusion and inconsistency actively harmed the release efforts. And the committee therefore urges the government to formalise and publish guidance outlining the exact criteria for determining whether the detention of a UK national by a foreign state should be considered arbitrary. Now, there will be cases, of course, where this is difficult to ascertain, but an ongoing assessment with the involvement of the family would be really recommended, because the family are advocates, they understand the individual, they know what support they need, and it's crucial that they feel that they are part of the process and not being treated as an inconvenience. And that was something we heard time and time again. We conducted this inquiry in good faith. Our sole objective is to improve our ability to secure the release of UK nationals unfairly detained abroad. The recommendations we made were based on evidence and the testimony of those who came to speak to us about the cruel reality of state hostage-taking. I do welcome that the government has accepted some of our recommendations to improve services provided to victims when they get home, because it was worrying that some people who had secured their release, when they came back, the government met with them, very impressive first few days on return to the country, a significant care support package, but 3 months on, 6 months on, that might be when that traumatised individual is ready to share, actually, this is what I needed. And these were the missed opportunities. And actually, when those people who had locked me in a room and were saying these appalling things that I had not done, when I overheard their chatter, this is what I took away that was a missed opportunity for you. So we need to do more of that. But I am disappointed, and I've never done a statement before on one of our previous reports. I have done this because I'm deeply disappointed by the lack of FCDO engagement in other areas, and there seems to be an unwillingness to admit that improvements can be made, and frankly a bunker mentality in some of the hearings we received. Most concerningly, the fact that the consular minister is not actually responsible for cases of consular is unacceptable. On the first day of Karen Merzer's trial, I asked the Minister for Consular what he was doing and what his views were, and he responded that he was not aware of that case on the first day of his trial. So it is vital that we meaningfully get a grip of this. So in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, communications can get better. The families in this room are here today because they experience the unthinkable and they deserve better. In the absence of government action, it falls to Parliament to demand action and to hold the government to account. We owe it to all those who are still arbitrarily detained, because the government's first job is very simple: to keep its citizens safe at home and abroad and to bring them home.